Albert Pellicer, who is a lecturer in creative writing and also in the languages department. And he's going to present a lecture entitled The Sonology of the Unheard, a Poetics of Timbre, which I am really fascinated to hear. So Albert, I'll hand over to you, and thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thanks so much for such a lovely introduction. I'm just going to share my PowerPoint. Okay, can everyone see my PowerPoint at the moment?
Yes, you can see.
That's great. Okay. Okay. The Sonology of the Unheard, Poetics of Timbre. I'm just going to present or use a very short PowerPoint as a kind of appetizer, in case we don't have time to go through everything. But at least you get an idea of the main points that I want to bring up, or points that I challenge my inquiries into the concept of timbre. Timbre is a very elusive term. Timbre, it is something that everybody seems to understand, but we often confuse it or mistake it for voice, or we sometimes think that timbre is only a term for sound. The truth is that timbre, its etymology, we could say, has two different schools of thought. And one is the German, which is Klangfarbe, meaning tone color, Klang meaning sound, or as an onomatopoeia for noise, and Farbe meaning color. And of course, we have many examples of synesthesia in color. Yeah, so we talk about different tones, different scales, but also there's another angle to it, and that is timbre, which means or presents a coup. It presents a surface, and it presents a bell. It presents something that requires action, and therefore it could be close to the idea of a cymbal, a drum, and timbre actually means the skin of a drum, of a frame drum, to be more specific. And also, of course, door implying that it's something calling and something that requires letting in or you coming out to. And this is a point that I use in this paper. Now, Albin Lucier, the great composer, mentions that timbre was mysterious until someone could demonstrate its existence. Now, it's been demonstrated in one way or another that timbre does exist, but the term or the meaning becomes very elusive. And Philippe Manoury said, one of the most striking paradoxes concerning timbre is that when we knew less about it, it didn't pose much of a problem. And even Michel Chion pushes to dissolve timbre to end the ambiguous term and substitute it instead with a name for the immediacy of sonic experience. Now, my research follows four premises, and one is understanding timbre, according to Pierre Boulez, that music and poetry were once the same unity, so that there is no definition. And that means that there was no word for music as such, or there was no word for poetry. There was something else. And according to Jacques Roubaud, the troubadours were the last to keep such unity. And according to Michel Deguy, who I base a lot of my research into poetic timbre, is the audible exactitude of the unheard of. And according to Casey O'Callaghan, is to hear the known sound that brings about sound. This in a way, challenges the researcher of timbre into bringing in different elements. And one is the ones I use is sense, the thing itself, accord, surface, coup, the formula here, T here, and noise and silence. And I'll briefly explain each one. Sense, not in the sensorial aspect of it, sense not in the concept of meaning, but sense as direction, simply direction that takes us somewhere. So when they say, for instance, that a poem says nothing or is very difficult to absorb its meaning, one could say you just have to follow the direction. You don't have to follow meanings and try to understand it. Sense, as in French, has been always translated into English as meaning, but not as direction. Then the thing itself, which I consider timbre to be the thing itself. And of course, it separates, and we can discuss that a little bit if we've got time, with Immanuel Kant's The Thing in Itself, which requires experience. And then accord meaning to agree with noise, agree with what is around timbre at the time of taking place. And of course, paying attention to the partiture, which, as Serres says, partiture refers in French to break, but also to set off on a journey. Yeah, so the beginning of that direction. And then, of course, if we take timbre as something that requires a coup, like as in Mallarmé, and I base the concept of coup in Mallarmé's Un coup de dé, that will not abolish chance, we require a surface. And my formula for here, T there, T standing for or equals to a time. So there is no difference between the outside and the inside once one is perceiving timbre, although this timbre sound could be coming not from the poem itself, but from the taking place of the poem. And of course, then that noise and silence actually go together. And that brings to 4 ideas, concepts, premises that I take into account. And one is that timbre cannot exist without noise. It could be paradoxical, but we'll see why that's the case. Not because of being paradoxical, why one is dependent on the other. And timbre challenges our Pythagorean concept of harmony, hierarchical structures, because harmony, to understand harmony, one requires things that are familiar with. Jazz, for instance, when it started, everybody thought it was just noise because nobody knew that kind of sound production. But once we became familiar, we can talk about harmonious sounds. And if, according to Pellicer, music and poetry were a single unity, then poetry and music were seen, heard, experienced differently. And why and when did they separate? I like always to read and reread this quote from Kafka's Investigations of a Dog. They did not speak, they did not sing, they remained generally silent, almost determinedly silent, but from the empty air they conjured music. Everything was music. And Jean-Luc Nancy, in his book Listening, says, what does it mean, listening with all our ears? And Spike, in another meeting, she pointed out to me that there is this Chinese character for listening, and it includes ears to hear, eyes to see, the undivided attention to focus, the mind, and the heart, which is the feeling, which in a way also goes along with the concept that Mallarmé said to listen with all our body. And having said that, let me go to the beginnings of writing. This is a Sumerian tablet. And I found out, not too recently, but reading about Sumerian and the translation of Sumerian that Sumerians did not have a word for reading. The word to read is actually to listen. And so when we translate to read a tablet, actually it translates as to listen to the mouth of the tablet, of the clay tablet. And I would like to add here in this Osdu, a poem by the Chinese poet Qi Xuan from his great book, Mosquito. Let me read that to you. On false causality and the true chance in a dark room. In a dark room, I put my ear to the wall and listen in. But here nothing is stirred my neighbors next door. Then suddenly I hear someone put an ear to the other side of the wall too. I quickly pull my ear back, sure to behave like an upright and proper man. The same aspect here of noise and observing from the outside, that is avoiding immersion, happens in the Renaissance, where if you notice a lot of the paintings, especially portraits, one feels as if one is observing things from outside a window. One is peeping in actually to the scenery, safe in the enclosure of the outsideness. And it was actually in the Renaissance that the distance, the perspective geometry was used to create that distant approach to things, which allows a more scientific conception of the object and the subject. Now, there's a very interesting thing here. It happens in the same thing as, you lean your ear against the wall, you look through the window and suddenly, suddenly you realize that someone is looking back at you. Also, during the Renaissance, they tried to do away with noise. But it happened, a great discovery was found there, and it is that by doing away, by disposing of noise, it is lifeless. And the esfumato was created, this little sort of a foggy aspect that creates like puntillism, a sense that there is noise. I can always think of a market without noise. It's a completely dead marketplace. Also, going back to noise, we've got from the book The Hatred of Music by Pascal Quignard, where he talks about the objects or the body, that make sounds without making sounds. And I quote, lips that tremble from cold in winter, consul Tullius Cicero's trementia labra. Yeah, the sadness or the cold would make our lips tremble, and every sound is a minuscule terror, tremid. It vibrates. And let me read this from his book, an extract about a Roman researcher in Tunisia. And it goes like this. In Tunisia, at the beginning of the 4th century, near Zuk Aras, in Tubiuscum Numidarum, the grammarian Nonius Marcellus inventoried all Roman words in 12 books. He entitled the work Compendiosa Doctrina per Litteras, and he dedicated it to his son. In a column in volume 5, Nonius registered the word terrificatio. Nonius Marcellus is the only one to recognize this word. It is not attested in any of the ancient texts that have been preserved. He explains its meaning, scarecrow. Music is an acoustic scarecrow. Such is bird song for birds, a terrificato, noise. And having said that, I would like, for those who want to look into Timbre further, I recently come across with the book Timbre, Paradox, Materialism, Vibrational Aesthetics by Isabella van Helferen. I've only managed to read the snippets of it from Amazon, and I've ordered the book and I'm looking forward to reading it, because it seems to me it's the only book so far that I've seen that gathers all the scattered information into one place. And I'm going to leave you with this picture as I read the rest of the paper, of the, a picture depicting the trobar, the troubadour's love. I've decided to leave this. They say that, instead of my face, they say that if you repeat an image, an ugly image, several times, it will turn beautiful. Or if you reproduce a beautiful photograph many times, it will turn ugly. So at the risk of falling into any of those categories, I decided just to leave that for the time being. The word timbre commonly refers to the different types of sound production that are perceived as the quality of a musical note or sound. It has also been applied to color, particularly when alluding to a spectrum of tones. The German word for timbre is Klangfarbe, which can be translated as tone quality or acoustic color. Paul Klee and Wassily Kandinsky, both knowledgeable in music, delineate sonic terrains with attempts to materialize timbre in their visual creations. In Kandinsky's view, for example, it is the abstract that retains the timbre of the organic. However, despite timbre's uniqueness, it has remained elusive between matter and ghost, and no definition has resolved aspects beyond musicality. This has allowed sonic experience to stay inside dichotomies such as spirit and matter, Cartesian mind-body opposition, and, of course, in this case, music and poetry, which, according to Pierre Boulez, were once a single unity that later developed separately. I adhere to, excuse me, to Michel Degue's conception that timbre is the audible exactitude of the unheard, as cited by Jean-Luc Nancy, and considers non-cochlear sound, not only related to the oral, as part of the materiality of language. Poetry is the memory of language, according to Jacques Roubaud. Nancy indicates that timbre is not incarnation, but carnation, flesh, plain and simple. I explore timbre as a force that traverses language and investigates what type of knowledge it brings into play. For the reader of poetry, what I present here can be an opening to the understanding of timbre on the margins of sonic interpretation, where words slide towards the abyss. A non-place and non-meaningful terrain that is reachable through language actions, not always evident to both reader and listener. It is a moment when timbre leaves its somewhat familiar musical landscape, and the notes, implying here both sound presentations and non-conforming notations of the event, as in the old Icelandic word nota, to note, also meaning to make use of something, achieve a communication through a unique and familiar postulations of the exactitude of the unheard, according to Michel Degue's conception of timbre. Cornelia Fales points out that the human mind does not process timbre in the same way as a computer does. That means timbre is not purely acoustic, but is also found in non-acoustic components and terrains. She calls this phenomenon perceptualization. Albert Einstein once said, "It is entirely possible that behind the perception of our senses, worlds are hidden of which we are unaware." Timbre takes us to these worlds, where we need to make sense, not by decoding meanings, but by understanding sense as an indication or direction to follow, a body in movement, or moved by its own vibration, what Maggie O'Sullivan describes as voicing my body, boding my voicings. Timbre identifies non-harmonic responses, enabling fresh involvement in the temporal perception of its materiality. Here, exactitude is not a fixed time, and therefore cannot be related to harmony. The relation timbre-time differs from the Western classical tradition that perceives time as linear, a vector going from here and aiming at there, where a progressive movement forward of implications and consequences is expected. I am referring here to a different sense of time, found possibly in the classic Japanese understanding of the binomial time timbre, where an emphasis of timbre means to focus on the present, often perceived as an extreme slowness of time. It is, I mean, a good example would be the films of Tarkovsky, for example. It is a space of in-betweenness, a gap that is an abyss, a pore that opens up to the unheard, an eternity of possibilities. Pascal Michon, in his article Neo-Artistic Rhythm Practices and Conceptions, referring to Mallarmé in his Crisis in Poetry, says, poetry makes appear the virtually of things and ideas. That is, things and ideas in a state of still unknown, or better yet, unheard of. According to Joshi Yuasa, the traditional Japanese concept of time is circular, with a focus on the eternal nowness, eternity, that is past, present, eternity, future. That is, through a focus on now, the listener experiences again eternity, which occurs in the present, the now being a moment affected by a coup. It is the poetic moment where slowness paradoxically conveys great motion and effect. Things change, but time seems to remain fixed. 3 words describe time in Japanese: mo, time or space interval, the space between events; naru, which is becoming, everything evolves and becomes; and johakyu, a kind of development of a sound phase understood as a constant timbre that contributes to the creation of a distinctive time experience. In the Japanese classical literary book written in the 8th century, the Pillow Book, Makura no Soshi, the sounds of the insects and the sounds of the wind in autumn are not considered mere noise or sonic effects in the background, a kind of muzak, but rather something that affects the event from its core, possibly deriving from the Shinto belief that trees, insects, and even words contain a soul, and that we are surrounded by 8 million kami, gods, that can transform the sense of the event being. While both poetry and music are based on temporality, they both reject an established idea of time. Pierre Boulez argues that poetry and music were one, and if we are to look for such synthesis again, the composition must take over what these 2 art forms share, a different sense of time. This would also require inhabiting an architectural space of composition, poem, where listening takes place. Poetry and music occur in the passing, not in the time-based chronology of past, present, and future, thus allowing possibilities of multiple actions in a reeling listening space of in-betweenness. Poetry takes us to the sonorous inanity, to paraphrase Mallarmé, of the moment as event. The researcher of cognitive and stylistic analysis in poetry may evaluate what is presented here as a half-closed door, since the thinking I am putting forward does not refer to the processes that unravel in our minds when reading a poem, but instead seeks the materiality of sound as it happens, embodying the gaps and the breadth of space. From a materialist point of view, Timbre does not leave a trace, but does take place and transform a space. It is the passage that is the passing of the thing itself and its being when a space is being defined or redefined. It is in itself the thing in something and the being in some taking place, as Nancy points out. The time that the poem takes to take place is already timbral, or all that will have taken place, as Mallarmé writes in Unheard, is the place. The poem as a literary form is architectural, where timbre functions as a key, not as a lock that opens the place of unheard sounds. This is the case of all poetic forms. A sestina, for example, by the repetition of end words, produces a stanzaic spiral, or the song-like inertia of a villanelle or other poetic structures can provide the incisions cut to fit the wards of a particular lock and open up to another space. It is, to paraphrase Mallarmé again, the ceremony of the book. Olympus' use of constraints embraces such a concept. Then the poet's role is to understand the proximity, continuity, and connectedness towards a newly unfolded space where timbre temporarily resides. This process is the result of the coup that, like a key, affects and opens the lock. When the poem has taken place, all that is left is the space it has unlocked, displaying by chance a unique constellation where language is unmade and unheard. That is, the materiality of language that requires remaking and rereading, a kind of palynode, as de Gueux puts it, but with nothing to return to, except perhaps our bodies as the present intermediacy of the poem. If we take Susan McClary's assertion that by far the most difficult aspect of music to explain is its uncanny ability to make us experience our bodies in accordance with its gestures. Timbre actualizes the body to manifest the primordial role of human movement in music through space transformation. A timbral moment immerses the body through anchorage and constrictions established by the poem. Sartre quotes Mallarmé in the introduction of The Traitor by André Gortz, and indicates the transformative power that the body as a reader can perceive, and reaffirms that, I'm quoting, "It is the book that imposes its duration upon you. You will discover the laws of this dangerous language at the very moment it is engendering them, but you will know at the same time that they will be unceasingly changing and that the whole system transforms them to the very degree it is based upon them." Gustave Sauvin, a great American poet who spent most of his life in Provence and a close friend of Charles, says in Towards the Blanche Alphabets that the science that unmakes language through self-enclosures that function like stanzas that keep the essence of the coup. So constrictions here are the result of a transformative external force, a coup that creates sense, direction, and works as a kind of method, but from its etymological meaning, that is meta, expressing development, and hodos, expressing way. When poetic timbre occurs in its temporal passage, it typically defaults to noise, and therefore historically has been rejected and considered as a moment incapable of keeping timbral clarity, or else it has been refined and reconstructed to the extent that timbre is no longer the sounding of language materiality to use Sullivan's terminology. However, as I will explain later, where words fail is where timbre is heard, hence its relation to the art of music. Reminders of this synergy can be found in the etymology of some terms used in poetry. For example, the Latin word for poem is carmen, meaning song, and the word sonnet translates into a little sound or song, a little piece of music. Stanza means little room, an acoustic location for the event, a place where the event disturbs the medium. The ancient Greeks understood the division denoted by the stanza as the place for musician to step into the strophe, meaning to turn towards it. And verse lines become, therefore, the stanzaic architecture of hearing. Furthermore, for the troubadours, the stanza was the receptacle for timbre, a shelter to keep desire safe from the abuse of an enforced reality. The artwork, after all, according to Adorno, is something that does not follow the established empirical reality, but moves itself away from it. Giorgio Agamben, in his great book, Word and Phantasm in Western Culture, states, I quote, European poets of the 13th century called the essential nucleus of their poetry the stanza, that is, a capacious dwelling receptacle, because it is safeguarded along with all the formal elements of the canzone or canso. That joie d'amour that these poets entrusted to poetry as its unique object. But what is this object? To what enjoyment does poetry dispose its stanza as the receptive womb of its entire art? What does its trobar so tenaciously enclose? And trobar means to find, and trobar means to create. And the poet W.S. Graham believes, for example, that timbre is something to be lived in. And this idea of inhabiting the plays, the poetic stanza. For instance, in Arabic poetry, the word for stanza is bait, which means house, and the space inhabited by words. And in the New Atlantis of 1626, Francis Bacon talks of sound houses, places of creation of sounds, which, despite Bacon's emphasis and analysis, function as locations to hear and create sounds, and he pushes the boundaries of what is understood as sound. All this tells us that when timbre is acknowledged inside the construction of the poem, it becomes perceptible, and yet it is not found in the poem itself, but elsewhere. That is, in the space where music and poetry are one or become the first poetry and therefore the first music. Amiri Baraka presented this view in an interview. I'm reading an excerpt from the interview, where he says, poetry is a form of music, an early form of music. Poetry is the first music. I think poetry predicts music, and I don't think you can disconnect poetry from music. I think when poetry gets away from music, as is the case of academic poetry, it tends to be anti-musical, having more and more to do with the rhetoric than it has with music. The more poetry gets disconnected from music, the less interesting it is, and the less likely it is to live as poetry. When we hear a poem taking place, it is the first indication of the unheard, the inaudible about to become audible. Fales observes and says, we hear, when we say, I hear a cricket, not I hear a sound that may indicate the presence of a cricket. Poetry predicts music, and we sense the body in the act of placing itself. Like Adrian Janus and Jean-Luc Nancy, I also situate this approach to timbre within both a contemporary genealogy of anti-ocular-centric thinkers and a more eccentric genealogy of autocentric, that is, ear-centered thinkers, such as Jacques Attali or Didier Anzieu and Peter Sloterdijk, who are all attempt to engage with another mode of being through attending to the sense of listening. However, I make a shift in the approach towards poetry, where the sound of sense becomes more relevant than the sense of sound, the latter having become the usual approach towards poetry in education. That is, by interpreting established elements such as alliteration, rhyme, or meter, and meaning, and by placing sense as synonymous with meaning and excluding other realities from it. In most English translations from French, we see, for example, that the word sense is translated as meaning, displacing it from an inclusive moving force. Timbre is found in sense. Sense concerning timbre is its direction or vector. Timbre is the thing itself, la chose même, in movement, noted as elsewhere. Such elsewhere does not differentiate between here and there, but rather follows the formula here hyphen t hyphen here, where t equals time and does not partake of the separation producing concept of the other. When we are listening to the thing itself taking place, we cannot receive timbre in its full existence if we are to approach it only through the recognition of our senses. We are also concerned with the nonsense of the here and now that requires constant making sense by moving through the passage in the direction it takes, which is nonsensical and non-semantic in amplitude. The title, The Sonology of the Unheard, Poetics of Timbre, partakes of the understanding that timbre is not exclusive to music, but also belongs to poetry and has a practical and theoretical engagement with the latter that has not yet been fully demonstrated. It is not my purpose here to reach a comprehensive definition of timbre, but rather to investigate its work. So far, very little has been attempted to bring about a theory of timbre in general, or as an investigation of timbre on both theoretical and practical levels with poetry. However, it is ironic to construct a theory of the sonorous when the etymology of the word thesis, itself theory, from the Greek theoria, merges seeing with thinking as looking at, viewing, contemplation, and points towards the dominance of the visual paradigm in Western thought. In any case, the question of what timbre is cannot be attempted in full, since any direct framing of its signification, if we are to allow the unique quality of sound as event, would at any given stage freeze a concept suffused with temporality, and for that reason impossible to separate from its moment of happening and from the time it takes to do so. It is a paradoxical moment when timbre appears, for it is not only a time of creation, but a disappearing instant. Thus, throughout the written history of music, timbre has escaped any encapsulation. And as we mentioned earlier, Alvin Lucier said timbre was mysterious until someone could demonstrate its existence. And timbre remains evasive, but acknowledged. And my purpose is here to establish its existence, disassociating it from a perspective of high definition and returning it to its etymological source, that is, tympanum, skin, or membrane, where an event vibrates as an unheard phenomenon. To be precise, sound is sound as it comes into being, and poetry is poetry as it takes place. Both transform and can be transformed by the noise of the world, as per Leclésio's reference to the act of writing. He said in an interview, writing is not just being at home and doing your own thing. It is also listening to the noise of the world. The language of poetry differs from other literary genres insofar as the grammar of poetry is different from normative grammar, and such deviations can be claimed as defining poetic language. Yet to study poetic language in this manner would divert us from our aim to perceive timbre. Therefore, we need to acknowledge certain deviations as directions or sense, both syntactic and lexical. What is at stake here is the actual sound of sense, direction, not necessarily audible, and often non-signifying. And Robert Frost, in his correspondence, wrote a relevant comment regarding the sound of sense. Here is one from a letter to John Bartlett, the 4th of July, 1913. Let me read that to you. I alone of English writers have consciously set myself to make music out of what I may call the sound of sense. Now, it is possible to have sense without the sound of sense, as in much prose that is supposed to pass muster, but makes very dull reading, and the sound of sense without sense, as in Alice in Wonderland, which makes anything but dull reading. The best place to get the abstract sound of sense is from voices behind a door that cuts off the words. I have also modified the common understanding of sonic perception by considering sound as event, supported by Casey O'Callaghan's theory that sound is event and does not travel as we believe it does in the form of a wave, but rather as a continuum of single events, one affecting the other. Matter or sound, matter, can be taken as a nominalization of the verb to matter, which draws attention to the action perceived as constructing of X moves Y instead of Y is moving. What matters is that what we hear is silence before sound occurs, thus providing a non-cochlear approach incorporating the fundamentals of timbre beyond the merely sonic. The true moment of sonic timbre is a non-cochlear hearing, hearing with the whole body, and it is more related to the audibility of an unheard present moment than to what is apparent. Ezra Pound usefully divided poetry into logopoeia, phanopoeia, and melopoeia. According to him, logopoeia is the meaning, or logos, in the poem. Phanopoeia is the making appear of an image, the visual quality that the poem evokes. And melopoeia is the sound and the music. If sound is an event, how accurate is Pound's division? If we want pure sound, we want music, stated Pound once in Poeticism. Yet, if sounds are constructed as audible occurrences, but not necessarily as themselves audible, we have come to a terrain where not music, but the unsayable and the exactitude of the unheard are in the place of pure sound. Then timbre is found not in the sound, but in the occurrence, which is sound. Pound's formulation needs changing if the idea of melopoeia is to be brought into the thinking of timbre. So far, it refers to a poem set to music, from melopoien, to write a lyric poem, to set to music from melo, poien, to make, but it does not consider the music of chance within the poem. The noise of a coup to produce sound by chance is in opposition to the dogma of visual determinism during the Renaissance period, where previously existing causes determine events. Chance is considered to be decadent because it allows noise in. Time is measured and divided into equal proportions, and to go against the established tempo means that the counter time can only be used as a trick to force listening to go back to its managed, standardized time within a confined space. Counter time refers to the taming of a horse in the manege, an enclosed area in which horses and riders are trained. It is the resistance or hindrance of a horse that interrupts its cadence and the measure of its manage. The Managgio di Contratempo of Countertime by Fieschi, written in 1556, distinguishes the different managgi, depending on the way the horses are stopped. He then lists the Managgio di Contratempo, in which the horse was first held in the direction opposite from that in which he had ultimately to do the volte, and is then turned on the straight line with a half pirouette. The counter time in this manner is no longer the possibility of chance, but chance controlled as possibility. However, the allure pace described by Mallarmé presents a different sense that requires a rhythmos from rehin to flow, and in the periodic motion of waves, although the sea at the time the ancient Greeks did not believe that the sea was flowing, they did not link to flow with the waves. According to Emile Benveniste, the word was used in ancient Greece to mean a form of something moving at a given time. Rhythmos was also based on the suffix temos, indicating a way or mode. It is only with Plato that the meaning was altered. It had prevailed for the early Ionian period. However, it is with Plato, Aristotle, and Aristophanes that rhythm came to mean succession of strong and weak beats within a notion of corporeal rhythmos, now associated with metron, to follow the law of numbers and establish patterns. A note written for the lecture Music and Letters in 1894, Mallarmé seems to adhere to the former sense. Chance is often defined as the opposite of intentional necessity, and it goes against what an established system needs in order to exist. Necessity here is the idea that everything that has ever happened and ever will happen to keep the system going is necessary and cannot be otherwise. Chance connotes falling, from the Latin cadere, or German to fall, a falling into a desire of the poem, into decadence. Chance is seen as a gambling with possibilities that destabilize the necessary harmony, and it is punishable in real life, for it threatens the harmony expected within the norm and brings noise which is regarded as dirt. It is known that adding noise to recordings improves sound, which is called dithering, a kind of random variation. In fact, the word dither means nervous vibration, from the Middle English verb dideren, to tremble. It comes from the realization that mechanical computers on World War II aeroplane bombers performed more accurately under the vibration from the aircraft. Timbre, noise, is the augmentation that affects the rational. O'Callaghan's approach, as expressed in his book Sounds, which much of my study draws upon, aims to change the conceptual filter concerning the rationale of sound, which is simply to be the result of the vibration of the air, by approaching sound as event, which opens a new and fascinating approach yet to be explored in poetry. That is, to hear the non-sound event that brings about sound. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Albert, for that. Unfortunately, I have to leave for another meeting, so I'm going to pass over to Kate, who is just going to round up with a couple of minutes for questions. I'm going to be watching that back. I just want to say before I leave, I just thought it was so brilliant and so rich. And I may come back to you later for questions.
Yeah, it was the PowerPoint was the appetizer. The restaurant is still open.
Can you just unshare your screen, Albert, so that I can't see myself? I don't like seeing myself.
I'm so sorry.
I can see like a million versions of myself on the screen. That's not good. So I think we have a couple of minutes for questions, just a couple. I have actually loads of questions, but if anyone else has anything they'd like to raise, please shout now. Otherwise, I'll just ramble. Okay, I will go then. I say we've probably only got a couple of minutes because we need to. I think everyone's going off to meetings at 2 o'clock. But obviously, I'm a linguist, so I'm thinking about this from a linguistic perspective, and I saw so many connections with the kind of things that I've been not working intently on, but kind of dipping a toe into. There's, I mean, from a linguistic, particularly pragmatics, which is about meaning perspective, there are so many parallels between language and music in terms of how we process them, and particularly when it comes to kind of emotions and those kind of harder to pin down parts of meaning. So yeah, I was really interested when you said right at the beginning, timbre cannot exist without noise. Because we kind of make the same point in the study of prosody, which is, would include the timbre of language, I guess, that you can't have that without it layers on top of language, right? It's kind of parasitic on there being another message there. So I was really interested in that, and just I wondered if you'd explored any of those kind of connections from a more linguistic-y perspective at all. You may not have done.
No, I have actually approached things more from non-semantic. But I could say here that one thing is to pay attention to a sound within another sound. So if you take away the background, if you take away the surroundings of the space that the sound itself, we could say a meaning that has created. If you take that space and empty it out, only have the one particular sound, then that sound becomes perfect. And by perfect means it's dead. Borges once said, a perfect man is a dead man, because it's finished. It comes from the Latin perfectum, something completely finished. So if we look for perfection, accuracy, I mean, Michel Degueux makes a great distinction between exactitude and precision. And exactitude does not measure things. Exactitude doesn't even consider distance, whereas precision, yes, it needs the meter. It needs. I mean, Mallarmé makes a difference between verse and verse. I mean, in English you have to say the line and the poem, the verse, but in French you have verse and it's also the line, as in Spanish. So he does make a difference between the measured one, which is rhythmic, that is, or the unmeasured one, which is rhythmos, where meter does not play a part on. It's also very interesting from the visual point of view. Leonardo da Vinci, who was the high Renaissance, he would ask his students to look at a wall and look at the stains on the wall, and try to imagine battles, faces, cries, sound, because that was noise. I haven't answered your question.
It wasn't really a question. I was just really interested in lots of little things. Just made me think. Yeah, I've talked about that, and yeah, I've thought about that, and you know that your idea about what the section where you talked about sense and meaning, and that's something that very much gets discussed within philosophy of language and linguistics and pragmatics, particularly this idea that sense does not give you meaning in its entirety, and you have to separate those two. So I was interested in that really, and yeah, I mean, I was just thinking about it from that linguistic perspective, but I look forward to reading and hearing more. So thank you. Did anyone else have anything? Yes.
Yeah, sorry. Fascinating talk, and if I may use an acoustic metaphor, it resonated with a lot of my work. Because my work is on the poetics of place and how place, poetry shapes place, and this idea of noise and that a place can't be perfect, that it's always in the making. I find really interesting, especially with the concept of home or Heimat that I'm looking at, which is very often taken as something sort of fixed and static and nostalgic. But I'm trying to reframe it as something, as you were saying, that is always in the making, that can't be perfect, but that only is created through the production of it. And I was wondering if resonance was something that you'd looked at in relation to timbre, because I think that's something that's both physical and acoustic, but also is talked a lot more in sort of sociology and resonance between people, between ideas, between voices, and how, or maybe, you know, when does a cacophony become a polyphony?
Okay, I'll just give you two examples. Maybe I won't be specifically providing the right connection to your question, but for instance, there is Dr. Stobbart from the Royal Holloway University. He's a musician. He's an incredible flute player, and he is an expert in Bolivian music. And he lived in Bolivia for a while, and he told me that he stayed in these places, only rocks, there are no trees, there's nothing, and it's very, very silent. Yeah, and the community there, they all play instruments, but they only play instruments once a year. Yeah, there's no rehearsal, nothing. They go, they take the instruments and they play, and they're playing, which is actually learned throughout the year. And I'll come to that. It's very loud. It's noise. Yeah, and then after that, they just bury the instruments. And they don't open that place. They don't dig them out until the following season. But before that, you know, throughout that gap of time, they listen to the river for new songs. Now, the interesting thing here is that he was telling me it's a very quiet place and they make so much noise. I played the flute, he said to me, the Stobbart, and I played, you know, a very complex piece, and no one was impressed. They thought I couldn't play the flute. And in contraposition to this, we have, for instance, the Amazon, where the nights are very, very loud, you know, the insects. And however, the type of music that indigenous cultures play there is extremely melodic. So, and again, the idea of home, the nomads, for example, and perhaps take poetry closer to what is a song, yeah, like canzone. And I mean, Bruce Chatwin's song lines, for example, yeah, that talks about repetition. So it's a memory.
Yeah. I mean, I find, sorry, we seem to be the last two, but I don't know where everyone else went. But yeah, the idea of repetition, I think, is really interesting. Oh, hello, Spike's still here. Yeah. The idea of repetition, I think, is really interesting, as also when it comes then to place, and yeah, because I was thinking of the concept of desire lines, which are names for paths that are created by people walking, you know, over grass, for example, and that only happens if enough people do it. You know, if that repetition, that trampling, sort of happens happens enough for that to emerge.
Mhm.
But yeah, fascinating. I mean, I look forward. Will it be available, that what you read, or?
Well, it's recorded. It will be in a paper. I didn't have time to finish this.
Right. Okay.
A lot more on the Renaissance and also the concept of repetition. But I'll be more than happy once the university is open, to have a chat over a couple of weeks. Yeah.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Okay, well, I'm going to have to dash as well, but thank you so much for this paper. Again soon. Bye.
Bye. Bye, Spike. Thank you.